is a town tucked away in the hills where life moves at its own quiet pace. The streets are cobblestone, the air is crisp, and the people greet each other with familiarity and warmth. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your business, and even your dog's name. Yet there was a time when the town was divided, each group wrapped in their own worlds, unaware of how much they needed each other. That was before Max came along, the stray dog who became the heart of the town. Max wasn't much to look at, with his thin patchy fur and a scar over his left eye. He seemed like just another stray, scruffy, hungry and passing through. He had no collar, no home, and no one seemed to care much about him. He was just another dog trying to survive in a world where most people saw him as a nuisance. His limp from an old injury didn't help his cause either, but there was something undeniably special about him. The townspeople first noticed Max during the early morning hours. He would wander the streets aimlessly, sniffing at the cracks in the sidewalks, his ears perked as though he were listening to a song only he could hear. No one knew where he came from or where he went when the day turned to night, but he always appeared at the break of dawn, as if waiting for something. It wasn't long before the first person reached out. Mrs. Thompson, a kind but lonely old woman, noticed Max one chilly autumn morning as she worked in her garden. The weather had already begun to turn cold and she knew it would soon be winter, a season that left her feeling even more isolated than usual. Her husband had passed away years ago, and while she had her garden and her books, there was a hole in her life that no flower could fill. She had heard about the stray dog, but it wasn't until she saw him up close that she understood why people spoke of him with such indifference. Max didn't look like much. His fur was matted, his bones thin, and his eyes seemed tired from a life of uncertainty. But there was a gentleness in his demeanor. He didn't bark or growl, he simply watched her with those soulful eyes. Mrs. Thompson, who had always been a lover of animals, felt a pull in her heart. Without hesitation, she walked over to him, breaking off a piece of bread from her own breakfast. "Here you go, old boy," she said softly, offering the bread to him. "You must be hungry." Max approached cautiously at first, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then, without a sound, he took the bread from her hand, his eyes meeting hers in a quiet exchange of trust. From that moment, something changed in Mrs. Thompson's heart. She knew she couldn't let this dog continue wandering alone. The next day, she left a bowl of water and more scraps of food by the garden fence. It didn't take long for Max to become a regular visitor at Mrs. Thompson's house. He would show up each morning, sit quietly as she worked in the garden, and sometimes even follow her to the small market near the town square. The townspeople began to notice him more frequently. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly anymore. He had a routine. He would stop by the bakery for a leftover crust of bread, then head to the butcher shop where Mr. Arnold would toss him a bone. He would make his rounds, never staying too long in one place, always moving as though he had a purpose. One day, Max wandered into the town square, where the children of the school played after their lessons. They had seen him before, but today was different. Max didn't just walk by, he stopped in the center of the square, his tail wagging furiously as he looked at the children. They laughed and ran toward him, circling him with their eager hands. Max, for the first time, allowed himself to be surrounded, his joy evident as the children petted him, and some even tossed him a ball to fetch. The children's laughter echoed through the square, and for the first time, the town felt like it was waking up to something they hadn't realized they needed. That was when things began to change for Max. The more he interacted with the people of the town, the more they began to see him as more than just a stray. He was part of the fabric of their lives now. He wasn't asking for anything in return, he just showed up, as loyal and consistent as the changing seasons. Max had become a symbol of what the town had been missing, connection. But it wasn't until winter arrived that Max truly became a hero. The first snowstorm of the season hit without warning, blanketing the town in thick, heavy snow. It was the kind of storm that made it impossible to travel, the roads impassable, and the power lines down. The townspeople huddled indoors, waiting for the storm to pass, but not all of them were safe. Mrs. Thompson had slipped and fallen while trying to clear snow from her driveway, and the fall had knocked her unconscious. No one knew she was in trouble. The town was too focused on its own problems, its own survival. But Max knew. He knew the old woman, and he had come to care for her in his own quiet way. As the snow piled up, Max trotted to her house, his paws sinking deep into the snow, his body weathering the storm. He sniffed around the house, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Max barked loudly at the door, his tail wagging in urgency, but there was no answer. He could hear Mrs. Thompson's faint, strained breath inside. Without hesitation, Max pushed his way through the door, which had been left ajar. He found Mrs. Thompson lying on the ground, her face pale and her body stiff. Without a second thought, he nuzzled her face, his warmth a small comfort in the cold silence. Max's persistent barking alerted the neighbors, who came rushing over. They found Mrs. Thompson in time to save her life, but it was Max who had led them to her. His loyalty had saved her from a fate she never would have survived on her own. After that night, Max wasn't just a stray, he was the town's protector, its unofficial mascot and its heart. People began to understand just how much he had done for them in his quiet, humble way. They began to take notice of how he had united the town, how he had bridged the gap between strangers and friends, between old and young, between the lonely and the hopeful. At the town's next festival, Max was the guest of honor. He rode in the front of the parade, his head held high, his tail wagging as the townspeople cheered. He had become more than a dog. He was a living symbol of loyalty, love, and community. He had shown them that sometimes the greatest leaders don't come with titles or speeches. Sometimes they come in the form of a humble stray dog who simply wants to belong. Max lived out the rest of his days in the town that had embraced him as family, and as the years passed, the people of the town would tell their children and their children's children the story of how a stray dog had brought them all together, reminding them that loyalty, love, and community were the things that mattered most.